The winds once whispered through the palaces of kings. Bronze tools glittered on the hips of traders who crossed empires without passports. Scripts were carved into wet clay, listing debts, gods, and the names of cities now buried in silence. Then, one by one, the lights went out. Not with the fury of invasion or the collapse of a single empire, but with a strange stillness. A quiet that spread like drought. Fields turned to dust. Ships stopped sailing. Languages disappeared. And all across the eastern Mediterranean, civilizations that had lasted for centuries vanished, as if the sky itself had turned its face away. You're safe now. Close your eyes. Let the ashes of forgotten empires drift across your breath. The Bronze Age world was never meant to feel fragile. It hummed with a rhythm that suggested permanence, stone palaces set like teeth into mountain ridges, ships drifting lazily between familiar ports, scribes hunched over clay tablets cataloging barley, oxen, and prayers. From the Aegean to the Levant, cities bloomed in terraced valleys and along coastal inlets, each one connected by copper roots and diplomatic letters, by marriage alliances and sealed amphorae. Mycenae with its lion gate and warrior kings. Hattusa, walled and secretive, tucked high in the Anatolian interior. Ugarit, a port of languages, where alphabet and empire traded hands under the gaze of dusty gods. Each city played its part in a system that spanned generations. There was no single name for this world because it wasn't one empire. It was a tapestry. Kings ruled from smoky halls built of timber and mud brick, issuing orders to provinces far beyond their sight. Bronze flowed through the system like blood, feeding weapons, tools, and ornaments, and bronze required tin, which came from far away. This was not a world of isolation, but of fragile cooperation. Its peace was a performance, renewed with each shipment, each caravan, each gesture between rulers who both feared and depended on one another. The palace at Knossos once issued records by the hundreds, clay tablets etched with signs that told of wool tallies, slave transfers, and sacrificial bulls. In Mycenae, scribes noted the collection of tribute from nearby towns, sometimes wine, sometimes women. At Ugarit, warehouse managers recorded shipments of grain, linen, and incense, every corner of the economy bound in cuneiform. These were not just administrative tools. They were lifelines, real-time snapshots of a world convinced of its own order. The deeper one peers into those archives, the more hypnotic the rhythm becomes, consistent, obsessive, exact, until without warning it stops. The breaks are never abrupt, they whisper. In Hattusa, tablet counts shrink before they vanish. In Ugarit, the scribes record fewer foreign goods, fewer names from abroad. A final shipment is noted, then nothing. Silence arrives like dusk, slowly, then all at once. The records don't say what happened next because the hands that would have recorded it were gone, or fled, or dead. It's tempting to imagine ruins falling in flame, but most of these cities didn't burn all at once. Some fell inward. Palaces collapsed not from battle, but from being abandoned. Stone walls that once echoed with ceremony and trade now crumbled under moss and birdsong. The silence that followed was not tragic in the way stories tell it. It was ordinary. Rooms once filled with record keepers and priestesses became homes for wild goats. Roads that had been dusted daily by traders. Feet turned to weed and thorn. In Mycenae, linear B tablets stopped midline like a breath held too long. In Ugarit, the last correspondence is a plea for help, grain, arms, anything, sent to a king who never replied. In the end, the silence was mutual. No more ships arrived. No more messages came. The economies of scale, once so elegant, so intertwined, became liabilities. To feed a palace, you needed hundreds of farmers, herders, smiths, and bureaucrats, all dependent on weather, harvest, and peace. When that chain frayed, the system choked on its own complexity. Children born in the twilight years of these cities may never have learned to write. What need would they have for palace scripts when the palace no longer gave orders? The knowledge that once flowed from father to son, mother to daughter, in the markets, the weaving sheds, the smithies, now drifted like smoke. The first generations who lived after the silence may not have understood what had been lost. They gathered stones from the ruins to build simpler homes. They found old idols and tucked them into their walls, not out of reverence, but as relics of a story they didn't fully remember. The silence of the Bronze Age cities is not just the absence of sound, it is the absence of continuity. A world so confident in its record-keeping, so careful in its counting, left behind unanswered questions, not because it failed to observe, but because it vanished too fast to explain. The decline wasn't cinematic, it was systemic. There were no final speeches carved in stone, just quiet warehouses, crumbling ledgers, shattered seal rings. In Hattusa, the monumental gates remain, but the people are gone. Their laws, their rituals, their disputes over land and inheritance, all vanished into the wind. We can walk through their courtyards, trace the paths they once took, see the thresholds worn smooth by 1,000 feet, but we cannot ask them why they stopped walking there. And so we piece together their vanishing like archaeologists of silence. We measure the decline not by battle wounds, but by absence. The pottery shards that cease to appear in layers, the lack of imported goods, the end of scribal education. What remains is not a chronicle of collapse, but a landscape where history has exhaled. The cities that fell quiet did not all fall for the same reason, but they shared a vulnerability. They had scaled a delicate system to its limit, and the system could no longer sustain them. Whether by drought, famine, conflict, or fear, or a quiet combination of them all, they slipped into memory. Some were buried by time, others were never rebuilt. We do not remember their last songs or the names of the children who ran through their courtyards. We only remember the silence that followed. And in that silence, the haunting truth that even the most organized, connected, and powerful civilizations can end not with a cry, but with a pause. That pause still echoes beneath the ruins. If you listen softly, you can almost hear the last footsteps fade. The walls remain, but the voices are gone. In the lands that once formed the beating heart of the Bronze Age, the river valleys, the coastal plains, the terraced hillsides of the eastern Mediterranean, life depended not on kings or armies, but on rain. Soft, seasonal rains that kissed the earth in spring, coaxing barley to rise and olives to swell. Rain that fell not just on fields, but on storage jars, temple steps, and the open hands of those who waited. These rains, once so reliable, began to falter. Not all at once, and not everywhere, but often enough to unsettle what had long been assumed to be stable. No one living at the time would have known the word climate, let alone climate change. But they knew when the rains didn't come. They knew when the cisterns ran low, when the fields cracked under the sun, when the herds gave birth to fewer calves. They didn't record the missing clouds or the shifting wind patterns. They recorded the consequences. Fewer oxen registered at the temple, more land left fallow, less grain stored for winter. Quiet signs that something essential had changed, not a sudden collapse, but a slow, creeping withdrawal of certainty. Thousands of years later, the story was picked up by other witnesses, not poets or priests, but trees. Tree rings taken from Anatolia tell of years where growth slowed, when the wood grew dense and narrow, speaking of dry seasons and thirst. In northern Syria, layers of pollen collected from soil reveal the changing colors of the landscape. A decrease in cultivated plants, an increase in drought-resistant scrub. Farther west, in lake beds across Cyprus, sediment cores show rising concentrations of wind-blown dust, carried across the water from dried-out lands. These traces tell a single story in different languages, a story of a land growing brittle under the weight of a long thirst. The systems that bound this world together were not built to withstand such silence from the sky. Rain-fed agriculture worked best when rain could be expected. It allowed communities to plant in predictable cycles, to rotate fields, to feed laborers, to sustain cities. When the rains failed, they tried to adapt to dig deeper wells, to store water in clay jars, to pray more fervently to the gods who once answered. But adaptation has limits when the system is stretched thin. One failed harvest could be born, 2 might lead to rationing, 3 could break a kingdom. In Egypt, the Nile still flowed, but even its generosity waned. Relief scenes carved into temple walls began to include imagery of famine, grain counted more closely, offerings stacked higher in hopes of appeasement. Farther north in the Hittite lands, tablets speak of a shifting balance, less tribute arriving from the fringes, fewer goods moving along trade routes once rich with copper and wool. In Crete, in Cyprus, in Canaan, the granaries began to echo. Not because they were empty all at once, but because they were filled with doubt. These droughts did not announce themselves. There were no celestial omens carved in stone to warn of 20 years of dryness. The people living through it likely saw each dry year as an exception, a hardship, not a trend. By the time the pattern revealed itself, many of the systems meant to buffer it were already weakening. Palace economies depended on agricultural surplus. Scribes recorded inventories meant for distribution, but when the surplus turned into shortage, redistribution meant conflict. The same records that once tracked abundance became inventories of failure. In Ugarit, one of the last tablets speaks of a shipment of grain that never arrived. The city's port remained open, but the sea no longer brought what it once did. Inland, the story was the same: less food, fewer animals, shrinking communities. The temples still performed their rituals, still offered sacrifices to weather gods and fertility deities. But even faith begins to bend when the fields remain brown. The logic of devotion falters when the sky withholds its reply. Some cities turned inward. Others became more aggressive, raiding neighbors to fill empty granaries. Migration increased not as grand movements of nations, but as small, desperate shifts. Families moved from hillsides to valleys, from valleys to riverbanks. In some places, people abandoned farms to seek work in cities. In others, they left the cities altogether, seeking land that might still yield something. These quiet migrations left little in the record, but their consequences reshaped communities, cultures merging, dialects fading, old boundaries dissolving not with swords, but with footsteps. We know now what they couldn't, that this drought was not a local phenomenon. The data suggest it was part of a wider regional shift lasting several decades, perhaps more. It was not merely weather, it was climate. A pattern large enough to break small assumptions, a change subtle enough to be missed, yet profound enough to undo a world. And even now, the precise cause eludes us. Was it volcanic, solar, a shift in atmospheric circulation? The answer may be out there, buried in another core sample, waiting in the rings of a tree not yet studied. But the people of the Bronze Age didn't need the reason. They only needed the rain. And when the rains stopped coming, they made decisions, each one reasonable, each one grounded in the knowledge they had. To store, to trade, to pray, to move. But history does not reward reason. It records results. And the result was a world that grew quieter, not because it chose to fall, but because it could no longer stand. The silence of climate is not like the silence of war. It has no battlefields, no banners, no victories. It arrives slowly, rearranging the margins first, then creeping inward. It leaves no heroes, only survivors, and even they are hard to find in the archaeological record. They left fewer things behind. Somewhere deep beneath layers of modern soil lie the dried-up wells of those years. Their stones are still in place, though the buckets are long gone. Nearby, the remains of forgotten granaries still sealed by dust. These were the lungs of a civilization, inhaling and exhaling the seasons. And then one season stayed too long. One breath was never returned. History remembers the kings and their wars. But beneath them lived people who waited for the rain and planned their days by its rhythm. When that rhythm broke, so did the world around them, not in flames, but in thirst. And in the spaces where rivers once flowed and fields once bloomed, silence settled in, soft and irreversible. The port city of Ugarit once shimmered along the Syrian coast, cradled between the hills and the sea. It was a place of trade winds and harbor chants, where ships bobbed on gentle tides and scribes pressed reed into clay by the hundreds. In its prime, Ugarit was more than a city. It was a node, a pulse point in a web that stretched from Egypt to Anatolia, from Cyprus to Mesopotamia. Here, alphabet and empire passed through busy hands. Gold, copper, ivory, and cedar moved with practiced ease. And grain most of all, arrived in steady rhythms, counted, stored, redistributed. In a world stitched together by maritime trust, Ugarit was one of the keepers of the rhythm. Its scribes worked in palace chambers cooled by shadowed colonnades. They recorded the volume of barley, the dates of arrival, the names of captains. The clay tablets remain brittle, browned by time, but still legible. They tell of order, expectation, routine. The ships came from Egypt, from Cyprus, from inland vassals. Their grain filled the granaries, supported the court, fed the laborers who carved stone and stacked amphorae. The palace gave because it received. When one partner in the chain weakened, others made up the difference. But when all began to falter, when rain failed in Anatolia, when harvest shrank in the Levant, when Cypriot ports sent fewer sails into open water, the balance cracked. In the final years of Ugarit's archives, the language shifts. The certainty of records becomes the uncertainty of requests. Grain that once arrived is now promised. Shipments that once were counted are now hoped for. We find messages sent from the palace to surrounding allies, asking then begging for food. There are no signs of war in these texts, only hunger. A slow, invisible siege laid by climate, distance, and silence. The scribes do not say so directly. They record what they are told, what they are ordered to send. But the shape of the sentences changes. There are fewer numbers, more conditionals, more unanswered questions pressed into clay. One letter, likely sent to a nearby king, pleads for assistance. It is polite, but the desperation coils beneath the formalities. Another tablet records that vessels have not arrived as expected. No explanation is offered. Perhaps the sea was rough. Perhaps there was nothing to send. Perhaps the ships had turned elsewhere, toward ports still full, toward buyers who could pay more. The palace, built on predictability, began to ration, not just food, but faith. The granaries no longer overflowed. The scribes no longer wrote in bulk. Behind these records lay daily lives, servants in kitchens measuring out smaller portions, priests offering quieter ceremonies with fewer loaves, mothers cutting rations in half. The palace could no longer afford largesse. What had once been an economy of surplus became an economy of survival. The city had no farms of its own to sustain its appetite. It had always looked outward to fields beyond the mountains, to harvests downriver. Now it looked and saw no reply. Still it waited. Ships had always come. Perhaps they would come late. Perhaps they had been delayed by storm or war or winds. The port remained ready, its wooden docks creaking in the breeze. But the harbor that had once smelled of salt and grain now carried only the sea. The cargo rooms stood mostly empty, their shadows lengthening with the seasons. Scribes still reported for duty, still baked their tablets in the sun. But the lists grew shorter, the silence thicker. Even the palace, grand in its architecture, seemed to shrink inward. The people adapted in ways not recorded. They would have stretched the flour, foraged in dry gullies, boiled lentils thinner. Fishermen cast nets in narrower circles. Merchants, once proud brokers of cedar and bronze, bartered for onions and barley. Children, who once watched ships unload gleaming goods from across the world, now watched their parents turn old bread into porridge. No battles were fought in Ugarit during these final months. No enemies breached its walls. But a different kind of enemy seeped in, the absence of enough. In one final letter, found half-baked and never sent, a royal agent warns that the palace can no longer wait. He urges action, perhaps military, perhaps diplomatic. The tone is urgent but directionless, like a man speaking into wind. The city had built its power on trust, not on armies. Its strength was its connections, and when those thinned, there was little left but memory. The tablets end suddenly. No dramatic conclusion, no last speech, just a final inventory, then nothing. Archaeologists found signs that the city was burned, perhaps looted, perhaps evacuated in haste. But long before the flames, the hunger had already hollowed it. The collapse did not begin with fire. It began with grain ships that never came. What lingers is the quiet bureaucracy of desperation, the clay slips, the measured pleas, the structured requests that suggest a world trying, gently, to hold itself together. There is something haunting in the calmness of it all. The way the palace kept asking. The way the scribes kept writing, as if routine itself could stave off collapse. And maybe it did for a while. Maybe the systems held longer than we think, propped up by human endurance, by ritual, by hope. But in the end, even the most sophisticated networks cannot feed themselves on memory. When the last ship failed to dock, Ugarit did not fall with noise. It fell with waiting. Tonight, those tablets sit in museum drawers, their wedge-shaped letters frozen in baked earth. They do not weep. They do not warn. But if you listen softly, they still speak. Not of kings or gods, but of hunger. Of the slow unraveling of a city that knew how to count everything except how many days remained once the grain was gone. The land had always spoken in rhythms. Spring rains tapped gently across terraces. Barley heads nodded in the breeze. Goats wandered between dry stone walls, chewing bitter herbs, their bells echoing across the hills. In the small villages of the eastern Mediterranean, life moved according to the seasons, the tilt of the sun, the shape of clouds, the memory of where water once pooled. But when the rains began to fail, the rhythms shifted. At first, just a little. A shorter growing season, a late bloom. A harvest not quite full, nothing to panic over, not yet. Families tightened their belts, stored more grain than they consumed, took fewer risks. They waited, as they always had, for the rains to return. But each year the sky gave a little less, and each year the ground held a little more heat. What had once been fertile became brittle. What had once been green curled into pale dust, on the margins of tea. Kingdom, in the dry hills and low valleys, farmers began to lose the conversation with the land. And when land stops answering, people eventually stop asking. There are no records of panic, no headlines, just traces. Abandoned homes, their hearths cold, tools left behind dull from use. Footpaths leading away from fields that had once fed generations. People did not flee in terror. They left slowly in thought after too many failed seasons, one last sowing, one last harvest that never came. Then they packed what could be carried, dried meat, a spindle, maybe a copper blade, and walked toward where the soil still listened. Toward the valleys where the rivers still ran shallow, but wet. Along the roads, flocks grew smaller. Cattle that once pulled plows now limped, their ribs visible, their milk sour. Goats survived longer, hardy, stubborn creatures, but even they thinned. Shepherds began selling animals not for profit, but for survival. Grain that once filled the belly was now currency, now offering, now memory. The migration was not dramatic. There were no great caravans, just families, one by one, leaving behind the bones of a life. Some tried to hold on longer, dug wells deeper until the water turned brackish or simply stopped, built terraces higher to catch every drop of mist, burned thornbush to clear space for barley, praying for a yield that never came. But when effort turned into exhaustion, they joined the others. In the archaeological record, their departure looks like disappearance. In reality, it was decision, quiet, reluctant, necessary. The palaces likely noticed. Tribute shrank. Taxes arrived late or not at all. Officials sent scribes to investigate, perhaps to threaten. But there was little to collect from a village of empty huts. What remained were old people or those too sick to move, staring at fields that no longer bloomed. The state, stretched thin itself, moved on. In those marginal zones, communal life had once been rich, shared bread, seasonal festivals, children learning to read the clouds. But now the festivals faded. There was nothing to harvest, nothing to share. Temples built to honor rain gods now stood cracked and silent. Offerings dried before they reached the altar. Some who left these lands ended up on the edges of cities, crowding into quarters not made to hold them. Others formed new settlements in valleys still blessed by springs. But these new places bore the weight of desperation. They lacked the tools, the granaries, the ceremonies of the old world. There was no time for ritual, only time to till, to dig, to hope the rains would not forget again. As people moved, so did customs. Songs, dialects, family gods, they all migrated, carried in memory. But some traditions didn't survive the journey. Languages mixed. Ancestors were left unnamed. The soil of the new settlements did not recognize their steps. And so, culture changed not by revolution, but by attrition. A long erosion of familiar things. Even the animals tell the story. Remains from this era show a decline in size and health. Herds bred quickly but fed poorly. Meat was leaner, bones more fragile. People began to eat differently, fewer fats, more wild roots. Malnutrition wasn't widespread, but it was creeping, gnawing, especially among the young. Stature decreased. Life expectancy dipped, not catastrophically, but measurably. Soft declines like dimming lamps. The earth, once a partner, had turned away. And yet the people still tried. They had no concept of global drought, no sense that other regions, too, were drying. All they saw was their own field cracking open under a merciless sun. Some blamed spirits, others blamed kings. Some simply blamed luck. They planted again, even when they shouldn't have, because it was what had always been done. Because hope, too, is a rhythm that's hard to silence. In the ruins, archaeologists have found fields that were plowed but never sown. Storage jars half filled and never opened again. Tools wrapped carefully in cloth and buried, perhaps as offerings, perhaps as relics of work that was no longer possible. These small gestures suggest the depth of the change. People didn't just walk away. They mourned what they left. The world did not collapse with thunder. It sighed, long and low. A sigh that blew across the hills and took with it generations of careful cultivation. The fields did not die violently. They simply stopped answering. And so the people turned their backs to them and moved on, not toward glory, but toward survival. And somewhere in those new valleys, the children of those migrants dug into softer soil and found water just beneath. They planted barley again. They watched the sky with the same nervous reverence. And when the rains came, and sometimes they did, the children learned to hope again, even if they couldn't name what had been lost. In the layers of time, these shifts are barely visible. A pottery style disappears. A village yields no. More ash. A path curves where once it ran straight. But behind those changes lived people who once knew every stone, every wind, every bend in the trail home. And when they left, they carried that home with them, not in bags, but in memory. The land forgot them eventually. Vines crept over thresholds, dust smoothed away footprints. But the story lingers, not in ruins, but in absence, in the empty terraces and the silent wells, in the slow breath of a field abandoned still, after all these years, waiting for the rain. In the twilight of the late Bronze Age, the palaces stood like monuments to certainty. Built of mud brick and stone, crowned with painted lintels and colonnades, they overlooked the land as if they had always been there and always would be. From Mycenae to Hattusa, from Thebes to Ugarit, their walls echoed not with warfare but with records. Clay tablets stacked in rows, seals pressed into soft surfaces, ledgers filled with grain accounts, labor tallies, distribution quotas. The palace was not merely a symbol of wealth. It was the beating heart of economy, a warehouse, a ration hall, a planner of seasons. Food did not circulate through markets in these kingdoms as it would centuries later. It flowed through storerooms. The harvest was brought in from the countryside, measured, recorded, then reissued by palace officials. Laborers worked in exchange for portions. Priests received offerings in grain and oil. Artisans carved ivory and shaped bronze under royal contract, fed not by profit but by provision. Even in times of peace, hunger was never far. But as long as the granaries were full, the system held. It offered predictability. It made survival bureaucratic. Then the reigns began to change. At first, the palace scribes may not have noticed. A shorter yield in one region could be balanced with another. A late shipment from a vassal could be supplemented from reserve. But slowly, and then more rapidly, the buffers vanished. Fields failed across wider areas. Surpluses disappeared. What had been a centralized strength, the palace as sole distributor, became a point of weakness. When the palace had less to give, it also had less to govern. In Pylos, in southern Greece, tablets show a detailed account of landowners, slaves, and food allotments. These records end abruptly, not because the scribes ran out of clay, but because the system that required record-keeping no longer functioned. The palace burned, and with it, the structure of control. But long before the fire, the signs were there: reductions in rations, increased references to borrowed supplies, shifts in temple offerings. In Hattusa, capital of the Hittite Empire, a sprawling complex organized the movement of grain from rural areas to city storerooms. It was a machine built to manage abundance. When drought hit Anatolia, that machine faltered. Reports from outposts requested emergency provisions. Communications with distant cities became less frequent. The kings issued edicts promising justice, but justice could not fill an empty bowl. The economy of favor, where loyalty was rewarded with food, began to fail its own promises. Some officials responded with control. They imposed stricter rules on distribution. They punished hoarding. In Egypt, during similar shortages, records show granaries guarded with soldiers, but force cannot summon wheat from dust. As reserves dwindled, cities saw unrest. Not grand revolutions, but small refusals, workers abandoning posts. Temple rituals delayed, a slow withdrawal of obedience. In Ugarit, tablets once filled with lists of shipments began to include warnings to neighboring rulers, to former allies. Grain was no longer a gesture of diplomacy, but a matter of survival. The palace asked for help. It received silence. It is easy to forget how much of this world relied on food not just as sustenance, but as structure. A royal court fed its dependents. A temple fed its priests. A city fed its soldiers. When the food stopped moving, the lines that held society together frayed. The laborer who built the palace walls expected bread. The artisan who carved furniture for the court needed oil. Without compensation, their work slowed. Their loyalty faded. Hunger didn't need to shout. It simply made cooperation impossible. In the countryside, those who once sent tribute stopped sending it, not from rebellion, but from necessity. A village that barely fed itself would not surrender its harvest to a city it no longer trusted. Slowly, the web of redistribution unraveled. The palace sent fewer messengers, received fewer gifts. Its reach contracted. This was not collapse in the dramatic sense. Walls did not fall in a day. Kings were not deposed overnight. Instead, authority thinned like parchment in the sun. Commands were still issued, but carried less weight. The scribes still wrote, but their audience shrank. Bureaucracy became ritual, performed, but no longer effective. In the heart of these cities, the store. Rooms stood half full. The architecture tells us this. Storage pits previously packed with grain show signs of being swept clean. Rats and insects left few traces. There was nothing left to take. In some sites, granaries were converted into living quarters. Space once reserved for abundance now sheltered the desperate. And with desperation came the erosion of the palace's role. Without the power to feed, it lost the power to rule. Some kings likely tried to hold on with spectacle, religious ceremonies, processions, appeals to the gods. But even the gods seemed hungry. Offerings shrank. Altars dried. Temples, once lively with chant and incense, grew quiet. People began to look elsewhere, to extended families, to local strongmen, to wandering traders. Decentralization was not a policy. It was a response. In place after place, the palace faded into irrelevance, and eventually into ruin. In Mycenaean Greece, signs of upheaval appear: burnt layers, abandoned sites, sudden architectural changes. But what stands out is the absence of rebuilding. When the palaces fell, they were not replaced. The people moved on, sometimes physically, sometimes socially. The centralized system had shown its limits. The people no longer trusted it to return. What emerges from this period is not just collapse, but reorientation. Power shifted to smaller settlements, to mobile groups, to communities less dependent on distant granaries. Simpler economies rose, more local, more adaptive, less ornate. The great palaces with their frescoes and courts were not mourned in writing. They simply ceased. And yet their memory lingered. Later generations would speak of lost golden ages, of heroes who ruled vast lands, of cities that fed all who came. But the truth was quieter. The palaces fell because they could no longer feed their people. Because a world built on central provision cannot endure central failure. In the museums of today, the tablets remain, neatly inscribed, carefully cataloged. They speak of livestock and oil, of bread rations and tax obligations. They do not speak of hunger directly, but between the lines, in the interruptions, in the repetitions, in the final entries, we feel the weight of absence. The last shipment, the last measure, the final seal impressed before the storeroom went dark. And somewhere in the dust beyond the walls, people built new fires. They baked flatbread without scribes watching. They planted barley without palace permission. They learned to survive without waiting for the king's portion. The palaces had promised stability. In good years, they delivered. But when the skies turned dry and the jars ran empty, the promise cracked. The walls still stood for a while. The rituals went on, but the silence beneath them grew louder. And in that silence, the people listened, not to orders, but to hunger. Not to kings, but to what the soil could still offer, and what it could no longer give. In the last light of the Bronze Age, the world still wrote in clay, not with poetry or prophecy, but with worry. From palaces that no longer ruled with confidence, and from cities slowly emptying of goods and grain, letters were sent, thin slices of earth etched with appeals, warnings, requests. They were not written for history. They were written for help. In Hadusa, the great capital of the Hittite Empire, a bureaucracy that had once managed thousands of scribes began to slow. The archives that once hummed with reports, treaties, and ritual calendars now recorded shortages. Clay tablets from this final period speak with a tone that is unfamiliar to the confident voice of empire, confusion, uncertainty, the soft edges of dread. One message, likely from a regional governor, informs the court of a town that has stopped sending reports. No cause is given, no explanation followed. Another letter notes delays in delivery of livestock. It closes with a phrase that was once formal but now feels desperate. May the king remain strong. But strength was already slipping. Far to the south in Ugarit, the scribes pressed their reeds with greater urgency. The port city, once vibrant with trade, had grown still. One of the last known tablets from its royal palace was addressed to the king of Elachia in Cyprus. It asks plainly for grain, not as tribute, but in hope. There is famine in our house, it reads. We shall starve. The tone is formal, but the urgency pulses through the clay. It was found half-baked in the palace ruins. Whether it was ever sent, we do not know. Whether it was answered, we do. The Nile Delta, too, received such letters. Egypt, buffered by the Nile's waters, had not collapsed. But even here, messages arrived from foreign cities, neighbors, allies, clients, describing attacks, theft, failed harvests, disappearing merchants. One letter from a ruler in Canaan speaks of enemies raiding the countryside, of temples being looted, of people fleeing. My lord, the ships do not arrive. The grain is lost. Save us, there is no reply preserved, only silence. These were not great proclamations. They did not speak in metaphors. They did not offer visions. They asked for very specific things: barley, oil, military support, clarity. They listed what was missing. They described fires. Some asked if the gods had turned away. Others did not mention the gods at all. Their authors knew that power was thinning, and they recorded its unraveling in real time, one fragile tablet at a time. The style of these letters is administrative, but the subtext is human. Requests grow more urgent over time. Polite openings become shorter. Titles are still used, but with less reverence. Some messages are unsigned, likely written by lesser scribes or officials who had taken on roles left vacant. In places where hierarchy once ruled every word, protocol began to erode. There are also signs of confusion: names misspelled, dates out of order, addresses unclear. As cities lost contact with one another, even the geography of governance faltered. A letter might be sent to a king who was already dead, to a city that no longer functioned, to a temple whose priests had fled. Still, the letters were written. Still, they were sealed. Still, they were baked in the sun and placed in baskets for messengers who may never have arrived. In the ruins of these cities, archaeologists have found many such tablets in final layers, mixed with ash, broken near collapsed walls, scattered in rooms that once served as offices. Some had been stacked, perhaps waiting for delivery. Others had been buried quickly, suggesting haste or fear. A few were found in sealed archives, protected until the last moment, as if record-keeping itself could preserve order amid collapse. The writing style tells its own story. The neat, balanced lines of earlier centuries give way to uneven strokes. Some tablets are smaller, as if clay itself was becoming scarce. In places, older tablets were reused, one message scratched over another, a sign of resourcefulness or desperation. We do not know if the recipients ever saw these final messages, but we know their authors never heard back. They were written in Akkadian, in Hittite, in Egyptian, languages of administration, of empire, but their voice is personal, One letter from a small vassal kingdom simply says, "We await your response. We cannot act until we know." It was found buried in dust, never opened. These letters are not epics. They do not celebrate victory. They do not mourn openly. But they feel like farewells, not grand but quiet. A palace aware that its world is shrinking still reaches outward, not for glory, for reassurance. What remains are these small artifacts of communication, these final gestures of connection across a breaking world. They remind us that collapse is not sudden. It is made of delays, of messages unanswered, of hopes pinned to letters that never return. And so the cities fell, one by one, beneath the silence. But their voices remain, burned into clay. Not the voices of kings giving orders, but of clerks, scribes, messengers, people still trying to do their jobs as the ground shifted beneath them. They wrote not knowing if anyone would read their words. And now, thousands of years later, we do. We read them not for their content, which is often mundane, but for their context, a glimpse into the quiet unraveling of a world that still believed someone, somewhere, was listening. But no one was. In the fading centuries of the late Bronze Age, when cities burned and empires collapsed, the sea remained unchanged. It moved as it always had, blue, patient, and unknowable. Across that sea came ships, unfamiliar and uninvited. Carved onto Egyptian walls are scenes of battle, of strange warriors arriving with ox-drawn carts and women aboard. Ramesses III, Pharaoh of Egypt, left behind one of the most vivid accounts of these arrivals. He called them the Sea Peoples. And for centuries afterward, their name would echo in the story of a world undone. They were described as fierce and sudden, arriving in waves, pressing inland, destroying cities along the coasts of the Levant. Their names were recorded: the Peliset, the Shurden, the Shekelesh. Some may have become ancestors of later peoples, absorbed into the lands they entered. Others vanished without leaving language behind. The Egyptian reliefs show them in combat: feathered helmets, round shields, long swords raised. And for a long time, this became the dominant image of a mysterious force from the sea, descending like a storm upon the kingdoms of the eastern Mediterranean, toppling the palaces and setting fire to the age of bronze. But the story was too simple. The Sea Peoples were real, but they were not alone. They did not bring down a continent. They arrived into collapse already in motion, not its cause, but its echo. Across the region, the world was already fraying. Drought had tightened its grip. Crops had failed across Anatolia and Canaan. Al communities had abandoned the fields. Palaces once full of grain were already beginning to ration. The silence of climate had preceded the thunder of invasion. In fact, many of the places the Sea Peoples passed through were already weakened. Ugarit, for example, had sent a final plea for grain before any enemy reached its shores. Mycenaean cities in Greece were already in decline. Hattusa, capital of the Hittites, had shrunk in both power and population. The Sea Peoples moved through lands already scattered with ash. It is likely that they themselves were migrants, displaced by the same forces that strained the civilizations they encountered. Climate disruption doesn't respect borders. It pushes communities to move, seeking water, seeking food, seeking survival. The Sea Peoples may have been refugees as much as raiders. Perhaps they were both. Famine makes unlikely invaders of the hungry. Egypt alone recorded resisting them. Ramesses III built a narrative of victory, of divine order restored through the strength of the pharaoh. He fought them in the Delta and claimed to have repelled the invasion. And in some ways he did. Egypt survived even as its neighbors fell. But the inscriptions carved into his temple at Medinet Habu read like both triumph and fear. They emphasize not just the enemies defeated, but the chaos avoided. Egypt, too, had come close to the edge. Modern archaeology has traced their path through layers of destruction, burn marks in cities, sudden shifts in pottery, collapsed roof lines. But not all destruction layers point to them. Many cities show signs of abandonment without conflict. Some burned, yes, but others emptied. And there are no clear records from the sea peoples themselves. No language, no inscriptions, no clay tablets bearing their voice. They remain known only by what others said of them. And others, it seems, needed someone to blame. Collapse is uncomfortable when it cannot be explained. The great powers of the Bronze Age had depended on systems of control, of planning, of divine favor. Their rulers claimed order, their gods claimed permanence. But when the rain stopped and the grain ran out, no enemy could be pointed to, not at first. The sea peoples offered a name, a face, a cause. Their arrival gave the collapse a shape. But the shape was drawn long before their sails appeared on the horizon. Even their origins are a matter of guesswork. Some scholars suggest Western Anatolia. Others point to the central Mediterranean, perhaps Sicily, Sardinia, or the Aegean. Their variety hints at a coalition or a wave of displaced peoples moving independently but converging in motion. Whatever the case, their impact was real. Cities burned in their path, kingdoms fell, but they stepped into a fire already lit. In many ways, the myth of the sea peoples became more durable than the truth. It was easier to believe that destruction came from outside, that invaders shattered the palaces and broke the tablets. But collapse is more often internal, more often slow. The sea peoples were not the cause, they were the symptom, the final blow after years of silence, famine, and doubt. Some of them settled. The Peliset may have become part of what later records call the Philistines. Their pottery appears in new forms, hybrid, adaptive, blended. They built towns, planted grain, dug wells. Like so many others, they became part of what came after, the new world that grew in the shadow of the old. Blame is a powerful tool. It organizes chaos. It offers comfort, especially to those writing history. But the collapse of the Bronze Age cannot be reduced to a single invasion. It was a convergence of climate change, fragile economies, political strain, and finally, human migration. The sea peoples were part of the story, but they were not its beginning. And perhaps that is the lesson buried beneath the ruins. That history does not always fall to enemies. Sometimes it erodes. Sometimes it is rearranged. The sea peoples moved through the crumbling framework of an age already exhausted, and for centuries they stood accused. But now, with deeper layers uncovered, we see the silence that came before their sails, the droughts, the grain shortages, the unanswered letters. The fire may have come from their arrival, but the smoke was already rising. It is a quiet truth that the end of an age may look sudden, may feel violent, but often begins with something slower. The sea peoples were not a storm, they were the tide, and the shoreline had already begun to shift. By the end of the 12th century BCE, the eastern Mediterranean was unraveling. Cities once lit with trade and order had dimmed. Palaces, emptied of grain and confidence, collapsed into ash or silence. But along the banks of the Nile, Egypt remained not untouched, not unshaken, but standing. It had always called itself the Two Lands, unified in name and divided in geography. Now it was something more fragile, a strip of survivable earth flaw. Etched by collapse. The Nile still flowed. Its flood, though weakened in some years, remained the great organizer. Along its shores, farmers traced canals with worn tools. Wheat and barley still grew, though not always in abundance. The river, unlike the drought-stricken lands of Canaan or Anatolia, gave Egypt its slow breath of survival. But survival here came with strain. In the reign of Ramses II, a pharaoh remembered more for struggle than stability. Egypt's inscriptions began to shift in tone. Gone were the confident proclamations of eternal order. In their place, lists, long, weary lists, of provisions sent to the temples, to officials, to a restless population. On the walls of Medinet Habu, Ramses carved his victories over the sea peoples with heroic flair. But beyond the carved stone, the court was rationing grain. The state-run granaries, once symbols of abundance, became pressure points. A series of papyri preserved in tombs and ruins reveals a government scrambling to feed its people. Officials debated how much to give to priests, to workers, to soldiers. In one record, laborers at Deir el-Medina, the village of artisans who carved royal tombs, went on strike. Not for wages, but for food. It is one of the earliest recorded labor strikes in history. They waited outside the storerooms, not with weapons, but with empty bellies. The famine was not total. The Nile still offered something, but the distribution faltered. The temples held stores. The crown tried to regulate, but corruption seeped in. When grain became scarce, it also became currency, and in scarcity, prices soared. Some officials hoarded, some sellers lied. Papyri from the period mention grain prices rising far beyond reach for common people. What once could be purchased for a small copper bar now demanded entire wages. Temples, once centers of divine ritual, transformed into relief centers. They became custodians of bread. Their granaries were weighed daily, and priests became ration officers. Some temples had more to give. Others, closer to the margins, struggled. When gods did not receive offerings, ceremonies faltered. When rituals failed, belief cracked. A spiritual economy built on reciprocity between humans and gods began to wobble under the weight of hunger. In the cities, things grew tense. Grain riots were recorded in temple accounts, not as dramatic outbursts, but as daily difficulties. Crowds gathered, voices rose. Stones may have been thrown, but the records are quiet about violence. What they preserve is mood, agitation, desperation, the erosion of order. The government, overstretched, tried to calm with distributions, with decrees. But the stores grew lighter. The flood was not always generous. Egypt had survived invasions before, but this was something slower, something internal. The sea peoples had come and gone, and though Ramses III declared victory, he could not declare stability. After his death, the royal line fractured. Successors ruled briefly. The priesthood rose in influence, and Thebes began to act like a state of its own. The pharaoh still wore the crown, but his reach shortened. In villages, the effects were quieter. Smallholders struggled to meet quotas. Those who couldn't pay in grain gave land or labor or livestock. Economic pressure became generational. Sons inherited not only fields but debts. Inscriptions carved in tombs began to speak less of triumph, more of perseverance. "I gave bread to the hungry," one reads, when others had none. Compassion became a source of pride, a sign that one had endured with dignity. Amid this strain, Egypt still functioned. Boats still moved along the Nile. Trade, though reduced, still arrived in the delta. Craftwork continued. Tombs were still built, though smaller, plainer. The state did not vanish, it receded. Bureaucrats, once plentiful, became fewer. Records became thinner. Taxes were still collected, but often in smaller amounts or paid in kind in bundles of reeds, in baskets of dates. Archaeological remains from this period show signs of adaptation. Grain silos became central to village layout. Pottery grew simpler, more utilitarian. Jewelry declined in richness. Diets changed, more fish, fewer cattle. The skeletons of the period show signs of intermittent stress, stunted growth in children, enamel defects in teeth, but not widespread starvation. This was not a people dying en masse. It was a people adapting, stretching, surviving. That survival required compromise. Royal authority was no longer unquestioned. In some regions, local governors gained autonomy. In others, temple complexes acted as city-states, managing land, labor, and law. Egypt did not collapse as its neighbors had. It frayed, it bent, and in that bending it endured. The final centuries of the New Kingdom saw no dramatic renewal. There was no great rebuilding, just continuity, quieter, thinner, persistent. The great stone monuments still stood, but fewer inscriptions were added. The language began to shift. The economy relied more on barter. In the south, Nubian influence grew. In the north, Libyan groups settled. Egypt absorbed rather than resisted. It was no longer a great power, but it was still alive. In many ways, this endurance is more haunting than collapse, because it speaks not of triumph, but of proximity to failure. Egypt held on barely. Its people lived not in glory, but in adjustment. They remembered what was, accepted what remained, and reshaped their expectations around what could still be salvaged. And perhaps that is resilience, not the loud return of power, but the quiet decision to keep going, to ration wisely, to feed a neighbor, to write on limestone when papyrus ran short, to bury a loved one with what could be spared, to chant the old prayers even when the gods seemed silent. Along the banks of the Nile, the flood still came, though not always as it had. But it came, and with it life, narrower, more fragile, but life nonetheless. The palaces of Hattusa and Mycenae lay in ruins. Ugarit had vanished beneath ash, but Egypt, weary and watchful, endured. Not because it escaped the storm, but because it found shelter within it, and waited with thin patience for the river to rise again. Long after the last Bronze Age city fell silent, the earth continued to record what people forgot. Not in script or stone, but in layers, quiet, patient, layered witnesses left in bark, in silt, in ice. In a world without a single storyteller, the trees, the lakes, and the glaciers began to speak for time itself. And though they cannot explain, they do remember. Each ring, each particle, each trapped bubble of ancient air, a soft echo from a year that passed in drought, or in cold, or in dust. In Ireland, the oaks grew slowly. Their trunks thickened in tight spirals, rings pressed together by a lack of light or warmth. Dendrochronologists, those who read trees as historians, found something unusual in the timbers. Around 1200 BCE, the trees across the region began to narrow. Not in a single year, but in a string of lean decades. Growth slowed, stunted not by axe or fire, but by something atmospheric. Rainfall patterns had shifted. A period of cool, unstable weather swept across parts of Europe. The trees did not scream. They simply grew smaller. Thousands of miles away, the lakes of Anatolia also remembered. Beneath their calm surfaces, sediment built up year by year. Microscopic pollen, grains of dust, flecks of ash, all fell and settled into layers as thin as memory. Scientists now core into those layers with long, hollow drills, extracting columns of earth that unfold time in reverse. In the Bronze Age layers, something strange appears. There is a marked drop in pollen from cultivated crops, wheat, barley, flax. In their place, hardy wild plants take over species that thrive in dry conditions, that flourish when human farming recedes. It was not abandonment that changed the pollen's signature. It was drought, a sustained period where fields failed and farmers left. Cyprus tells the same story in dust. Inland lakes, once surrounded by rich forests and farmland, show a sudden increase in mineral content and airborne particles. It's a sign of erosion, topsoil blown across dry land, washing into water. That kind of erosion comes only when the land is laid bare, when crops don't grow, when rains don't fall, when a farmer turns his back and walks away. The silt says nothing of politics, but it speaks of pressure, of a climate tilting toward failure. And farther still, beneath the ice of Greenland, the sky's breath is preserved. Ice cores drilled deep into the glacial shield trap ancient air in bubbles time capsules from a world that no longer exists. These layers, too, show a signal. Slight fluctuations in greenhouse gases, traces of sulfate particles from distant volcanic eruptions, a dip in solar activity. None of these alone caused the collapse of the Bronze Age, but together they suggest a world under quiet stress. A subtle disruption, not just in one region, but across hemispheres. The story told by these natural witnesses is not loud. It offers no villains, no singular event. What it gives us is texture. A soft pattern of tension spreading slowly across ecosystems. A string of dry years, shorter growing seasons, rising winds that carried more dust, rivers that ran low. And people living without the language of climate science responded with what they had: migration, rationing, prayer. Climate archaeology does not provide answers. It gives context, a frame into which the last letters from kings, the sudden disappearance of villages, and the burned layers in forgotten cities all begin to fit. When the tree rings narrow across Ireland, and the pollen shifts in Anatolia, and the ice tells of colder skies, it is no longer coincidence. It is convergence. These records are not easy to read. They require patience, precision, and humility. A single bad year does not Kia collapse, but decades of pressure do. What the trees remember is not a single disaster, but a weakening of systems, of trust, of rainfall. They mark not an explosion, but an exhale. And perhaps what is most striking is how far this memory reaches. That in lands never touched by the Hittites, never ruled by pharaohs, the earth still bears witness to the same shift. Climate knows no borders. It moved through soil and sky, affecting lives unequally but persistently. Some regions dried, others chilled, all adapted, some too slowly. The cities of the Bronze Age did not know that trees in distant forests were shrinking, or that lakes were catching the dust of failed harvests. But they felt the consequences. Their scribes recorded less grain. Their temples held shorter ceremonies. Their people moved away. Today, we return to those places not with armies, but with tools, drills, microscopes, sensors. We ask the earth what happened, and it answers in thin lines and layered silt, not loudly but clearly. It is easy to think of history as something told by people, but long before us, and long after, the earth tells its own story. In the rings of an old tree, in the quiet bottom of a lake, in the frozen breath of ancient air, it whispers of years when the balance shifted, when nature bent just enough to unravel what had seemed unshakable. What the trees remember is not collapse, but change, not catastrophe, but accumulation. And somewhere in that accumulation, the weight became too much. And still the trees grow. Still the lakes collect pollen and dust. Still the ice deepens. The earth remembers patiently, even when we forget. After the last palace doors closed, after the clay tablets crumbled into dust and the scribes laid down their styluses, something softer vanished, not a building or a city, but a habit, a sound, a movement of the hand across wet clay. The careful press of a reed into words meant to last. Across vast stretches of the ancient world, writing disappeared. Not slowly, not gently, but with a quiet so total it feels like forgetting. In the centuries before the collapse, writing had become ordinary. Not widespread, not everyone read, not everyone wrote, but present. In the palaces of Mycenaean Pylos, tablets were stacked in neat piles, filled with lists of grain, livestock, armor, and names. In Hadusa, the Hittite capital, scribes worked in teams, translating between Akkadian and Hittite, cataloging treaties and incantations, calculating the tribute owed from distant vassals. In Ugarit, along the coast of Syria, writing flourished in multiple scripts. The Ugaritic alphabet, carved into clay, offered a simpler alternative to cuneiform, elegant, phonetic, efficient. Traders used it, priests used it, kings used it. But then it stopped. In the archaeological layers that follow the collapse in Greece, Anatolia, Canaan, the tablets are gone. The seals are gone. The inscriptions, once chiseled into walls or painted onto pots, are absent. For centuries, no new writing appears. No records of births, deaths, shipments, prayers. Not even graffiti scratched onto a wall. Silence, deep and complete. Linear B, the script of Mycenaean Greece, vanished entirely. It would not be deciphered again until the 20th century. The scribes who used it, trained within palace bureaucracies, their knowledge passed through generations, had no reason to continue. When the palaces fell, their purpose dissolved. There were no more inventories to track, no more shipments to log. Their skill, once sacred, became obsolete, and so it died not in battle but in disuse. In Anatolia, the cuneiform tradition had stretched for 1,000 years. But after Hattusa fell, the tablets stopped being made. Across the region, the distinctive script wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay ceased to appear. The libraries, once full of legal codes and medical texts, fell into ruin. Clay is durable, but when it is not made, it leaves gaps that no ruin can fill. The scribes had been elite, but they were not immortal. Without institutions to house and fund their work, they simply disappeared. Ugarit had once been a center of innovation. The alphabet itself was young, promising, efficient, but its destruction was swift. Its archives, when found centuries later, were buried under ash. They preserved the last days of literacy like an insect in amber, intact, but lifeless. No one continued the Ugaritic script. It had no students, no successors. Its clarity was not enough to save it. Egypt fared better. Its script did not vanish. But even there, the tone shifted. In the centuries following the Bronze Age collapse, inscriptions grew fewer. Papyrus, perishable and precious, left behind only fragments. Hieroglyphs remained in temple reliefs, but the language of administration, once robust and prolific, shrank. Bureaucracies thinned. The scribal class, once expansive, narrowed to ritual roles. Writing became sacred again. Esoter. Ike remote. What does it mean when a world forgets how to write? It does not mean that language is lost. People still spoke, still remembered, still sang. But memory became fragile. Oral traditions returned to prominence, stories passed from mouth to ear, shifting with each telling. Timelines blurred, facts faded, myths grew stronger. In Greece, the centuries that followed the collapse would later be called a dark age, not because of total ruin, but because no one wrote anything down. For over 400 years, there are no inscriptions, no contracts, no ledgers. Nothing but silence. Trade did not stop entirely, but it shrank. Without records, there were no receipts, no accounts of deals made or broken. Law had to rely on memory, not precedent. Disputes were settled by elders, not by written code. Religion persisted, but the prayers were not carved. Gods were invoked aloud. The permanence once promised by writing gave way to the uncertainty of speech. The tools of literacy, tablets, styluses, ink, scripts, had been tied to palaces, temples, and courts. When those institutions faltered, so too did the habits they maintained. A child born in 1100 BCE in Greece had no chance of learning to write, not because the knowledge had been banned, but because no one around them knew how. Literacy was not repressed. It simply vanished into the dust of collapsed walls. The implications were quiet but vast. A world that had once counted its stores and measured its seasons in symbols now guessed. Taxation became informal. Inheritance relied on family testimony. The past became a story, not a record. In this silence, new cultures began to form. Simpler, more local, more flexible, but less connected, less remembered. It is easy to underestimate what is lost when writing disappears. But history is stitched together through text. When writing dies, time loses its anchors. Dates blur. Events dissolve into rumor. The collapse of literacy in the post-Bronze Age world did not just erase knowledge, it changed the shape of knowing. And yet, writing would return. In Phoenicia, a new alphabet emerged, leaner, easier to learn, easier to adapt. It spread to Greece, where it was reshaped and passed on again. Slowly, writing became more accessible, less tied to priesthoods and palaces. But that rebirth was generations away. In the meantime, people lived amid ruins that once held words. They walked through halls where no records were kept. The wind moved through cities that had once spoken in script, and for a long time, no one wrote it down. It is one thing to lose a city, another to lose the memory of how it once described itself. The collapse of writing was not a dramatic event. It was a drift, a fading of ink, a silence in the clay, a forgetting, slow and irreversible. And in that silence, a new world began to form, uncertain of its past and unsure what to carve into the future. The collapse did not kill everyone. It never does. When the great cities dimmed, when the palaces emptied and the records stopped, most people simply walked away. Not in crowds or parades, not in mourning or revolt. They left quietly with their tools and their families, climbing into the hills, seeking water, safety, and land that might still answer to their labor. Civilization had not ended, it had dispersed. Along the limestone ridges of the Levant, in the steep folds of Greece, and across the dry plateaus of Anatolia, small fires began to flicker in the dark. Not from armies, but from hearths. From hilltop villages hastily arranged with stone walls, roofed with brush carved into rock. These new homes were not grand, they were practical. Dug near springs, built within view of their own fields, crops grew short. Yields were thin, but they were enough. What was once a world of interconnected trade routes, of ships moving copper and tin between palaces, gave way to something local, intimate, and hard. A family might now grind its own grain, weave its own cloth, and trade only with neighbors. Metal was scarce. Clay was reused. Storage pits were dug deeper. What had once come in caravans, olive oil, wine, spices, now came from one's own press, or not at all. Some settled in caves, not as hermits, but as families. In places like central Cyprus and the southern Greek mainland, archaeological remains show that natural shelters were expanded with walls, hearths, and tool debris. These caves were cool in summer, warm in winter, and hard to reach, and that was the point. In a time when predictability had vanished, remoteness became its own kind of wealth. Security was measured not in gold, but in distance. In Anatolia, entire communities migrated into high valleys, clustering near mountain streams. Livestock herding returned to prominence. Sheep and goats could graze where crops failed. Children were taught to move with the flocks, to recognize safe passes, to boil milk into hard cheese that would last the winter. These were not the glories of empire. They were the quiet rituals of survival. Writing was gone, trade was gone, but life adapted. A mud brick house might now shelter 3 generations. Roofs were repaired with branches. Old bronze tools, once ceremonial, were sharpened down and repurposed. Pottery styles simplified. Decoration gave way to function. The wide, decorated amphorae of the palace economies were replaced by courseware, thick, plain, and meant to last. Burial changed too. In the earlier centuries, tombs had been elaborate, filled with goods, painted with symbols, marked for the gods. Now the graves were shallow, the offerings few, a bead, a simple jar, sometimes nothing at all. Yet these people did not live without meaning. Their lives were full of rhythm. The rhythm of planting, of tending, of keeping watch, of rebuilding what could be built again. Religious practices adapted to the land. Temples had once stood in stone courtyards, attended by priests and supplied by palace rations. Now, worship was often private or communal in smaller ways. Simple shrines, stones arranged in circles, niches carved into walls replaced grand sanctuaries. Figurines were still made, but they were smaller, rougher, pressed by hand, carried in baskets. The divine had not disappeared. It had moved closer to the fire. The isolation that marked these hilltop communities did not mean stillness. People still traveled short distances, cautious exchanges. Clay tablets no longer recorded the terms of these meetings, but we see the evidence in the pottery fragments, in borrowed tool designs, in shared customs that stretched over ridges. Culture shrank, but it did not break. It became quieter, more personal. And yet survival had a cost. Nutrition suffered. Human remains from this period show evidence of stunted growth, worn joints, and disease. Life expectancy dropped. Infant mortality rose. For many, this was not a noble return to simplicity. It was a retreat under pressure. But even in these hard conditions, people found a way to continue. They adapted not by choice, but by instinct, the most ancient inheritance of all. Time passed, seasons changed. Children were born who never knew the palaces, never learned to read, never saw ships heavy with tin or cedar or lapis. To them, the world was not broken. It was simply theirs, small, familiar, and real. A world where the hills mattered more than the coast, where the well was watched more closely than the sky. Where every tool had a story, every field a name, every day a task. And gradually, across decades and then centuries, new ways of life emerged from these scattered beginnings. Some of the hilltop settlements grew. Paths became roads. Stone replaced mud. New scripts were born. New trade routes emerged, slower and less grand, but steady. From the cracks of collapse, continuity took root. But in that first generation, the ones who left the cities, who climbed the ridges and chose caves over courtyards, there was only the work of getting by. Their stories were not written. Their names are mostly lost. What remains are their homes built into stone, their pottery coarse and handmade, the ash of their hearths layered in dirt. These small traces whisper not of glory, but of endurance. And in the quiet of those high valleys, far from the palaces now buried by time, the firelight flickered again. Not brightly, but enough to keep going, enough to wait for the next world to arrive. It began quietly, as many endings do, not with the last sword drawn or the final ingot cast, but with a delay. A shipment that didn't arrive, a supplier who stopped replying, a forge that cooled for too long. Bronze, the metal that had shaped an age, began to fade, not because people forgot how to make it, but because they could no longer find the parts. For centuries, bronze had been the material of civilization. It carved statues, armed warriors, joined chariots, and laid the foundations of tools and weapons alike. But bronze is not found in nature. It is made a blend, a relationship. 90% copper, 10% tin, more or less, and therein lay its fragility. Copper was more common. Tin was not. In the late Bronze Age world, tin came from far away. From the mountains of Central Asia, the rivers of Britain, the deserts of Anatolia. No empire had both metals in abundance. They relied on one another, on trade, on trust, on a system that worked until it didn't. When the trade routes collapsed, when roads became unsafe, ports fell silent, and scribes stopped recording exchanges, the alloy that had defined a world grew rare. Not all at once. But year by year, tool by tool, sword by sword, the supply thinned. Smiths tried to adapt. They reused what they could, melted down old blades and recast broken tools. But recycling could only go so far. Eventually, even the scrap was gone. Archaeology shows this change not in words, but in chemistry. Metallurgical analysis of tools and weapons from the period reveals a growing inconsistency. The purity of bronze fluctuates. More impurities, more variations. Copper mixed with whatever was available, lead, arsenic, even bits of iron. A sign not of experimentation, but of desperation. The old standards were no longer possible. The forges did not fall silent. They grew uncertain. And with that uncertainty came risk. A bronze sword was once a mark of order, of strength. It required infrastructure, miners, traders, smiths, warriors. It signaled that a state could move goods across great distances, could tax and distribute and equip. But a sword made poorly, a blade that bent or broke, could not defend a village. It could not project power. And so, slowly, bronze stopped being the metal of the future. It became the memory of the past. In some regions, like the Levant and Greece, this shift is visible in burial goods. Graves that once contained fine bronze weapons and ornaments began to include simpler tools, or none at all. Ceremonial daggers were passed down like heirlooms, not remade. Decorative pins were cast in cheaper alloys or shaped from bone. Prestige adapted, wealth recalibrated. But it was not merely a symbolic change. The loss of bronze was practical. Farmers depended on bronze sickles to cut grain. Builders needed bronze chisels to shape wood and stone. Without access to tin, these tools dulled faster, broke more easily. Productivity slowed. Repairs increased. In a world already under stress from climate, from famine, from migration, this decline in tool quality made every harvest harder, every shelter more fragile. The social consequences deepened. Bronze had once connected regions through mutual need. Its production demanded cooperation. Its absence encouraged isolation. Communities that had once depended on trade turned inward. Local materials were used in local ways. Regional styles re-emerged. In some cases, knowledge was lost. In others, it was hoarded. Innovation emerged, but not quickly. Iron had existed for centuries, but it was difficult to work. Unlike copper and tin, which melt easily and cast well, iron required higher temperatures, more fuel, more time. Early iron was brittle, uneven, and expensive. It was not immediately better than bronze, but it was abundant. It could be found close to home. It offered resilience in a world where distance had become dangerous. At first, iron was used sparingly for small items, tools, nails. Then, gradually, as smelting techniques improved, it began to take on bronze's old roles, a knife here, a plowshare there. The change was uneven. Some areas adopted iron early. Others clung to bronze as long as they could, but the tide had turned. Not because people chose it, but because they had no choice. The end of bronze did not come with ceremony. It came with adjustment. A smith cooling his forge for the last time. A farmer using a dull tool a few more seasons. A trader changing routes or quitting altogether. A world once gilded in an alloy of alliance now turned to iron, colder, harsher, but local. In the ruins of cities like Ugarit and Mycenae, bronze items are found buried in ash. Not because they were left behind, because they were too valuable to carry. In times of collapse, metal is life. But even then, the hoards grew smaller. The molds disappeared. The smelting pits fell quiet. And yet the end of bronze was not the end of skill. The artisans adapted. They learned to hammer iron, to heat and fold and temper. The knowledge of fire endured. In time, iron tools would surpass their bronze ancestors, not in beauty, but in strength. Iron would build new empires, but in these early centuries it was a compromise, a symbol not of ambition, but of survival. The Bronze Age had been defined by complexity, trade routes that stretched for thousands of miles, ships laden with metals and goods, palaces that managed distribution, temples that received offerings in the form of tools and weapons. Bronze had tied the system together. Its loss unraveled the strands. And so an age ended, not with a battle or a flood, but with the slow dimming of fires in distant forges, with the quiet resignation of a smith who no longer had what he needed, with the shift of a world that could no longer afford the metal it had once called its own. The hills remained, the rivers still flowed. People still worked, still forged, still carved meaning from their days, but the color of the tools had changed, and with it a chapter in human history closed, not loudly, but completely. Long after the palaces of Mycenae had crumbled, after the scribes had stopped pressing their signs into clay, and the last bronze blades dulled in dust, voices still carried something forward, not in ledgers or annals, but in rhythm and breath. Across the hills of a quieting Greece, where shepherds led goats through ruins they did not name, stories began to gather shape. They passed between mouths, across firelight, told at dusk to children who had never seen a palace, but would one day hear. Of kings, by the time Homer's verses were spoken aloud, perhaps in the 8th century BCE, the collapse of the Bronze Age was already hundreds of years old. The world he described was a dream painted in ash and glory. But it was not fiction. It was memory stretched into poetry. In the Iliad and the Odyssey, fragments of that older world flicker like embers beneath the verse. Great walls, long voyages, noble houses fallen, warriors who fought in shining bronze and then vanished into the earth. These were not the details of the present. They were echoes. In Homer's epics, the gods speak and interfere, but they do not save. The kings are proud, often flawed. The homes they return to are fragile. In the Odyssey, Odysseus does not return to empire. He returns to a house that barely remembers him, to a world unsure of its own footing. It is a story of loss wrapped in cleverness, a tale of return, but not restoration. The ruins of Mycenae, Turins, and Pylos still stood in Homer's time. Their stones were too large, too precise, for the people of the New Age to understand. The later Greeks called them Cyclopean, imagining giants had built them. In truth, they had been made by human hands, guided by palatial systems long gone. But to the listeners of Homer's epics, they were the remains of a heroic age. An age they no longer fully knew, but still wanted to believe in. Oral tradition has its own logic. It does not preserve facts precisely. It preserves meaning. And in the memory of the collapse, that meaning became myth. The fall of Troy may not have caused the end of the Bronze Age, but its story endured because it captured the sense of loss. A city destroyed, a world undone, a conflict that left behind nothing but wanderers and widows. In this way, Homer did not invent history. He sang it, softened, mythologized, shaped by generations of mouths before him. The details are revealing. In the epics, warriors wear boar's tusk helmets, a feature common in Mycenaean graves, but unknown in Homer's own time. Ships are described in ways that match late Bronze Age design. The palaces of the Odyssey are filled with gold, bronze, and distant goods, more akin to what once filled the storerooms of Pylos or Knossos than anything in the geometric period. These anachronisms are not mistakes. They are fossils, embedded traces of older memory, carried forward by the scaffolding of story. And yet the songs do not praise bureaucracy or empire. They remember the individuals, Achilles, Hector, Penelope, not the systems that fed them. The collapse of the Bronze Age was not preserved as a political tragedy. It became personal, a fallen wall, a waiting wife, a son grown in absence. Myth filtered the event through emotion, not chronology. It is through this lens that much of the late Bronze Age now survives. Not through state archives or royal decrees, which were burned or buried, but through the quiet persistence of song. Songs told by people who had no temples left to visit, no palaces left to enter, but who still needed to explain the ruins beneath their feet. There's irony in how the oldest stories endure longest not because they were written down early, but because they were remembered aloud. Oral poetry has rhythm, repetition, a cadence meant to stick. It is adaptive, reshaped in each telling, suited to the needs of each audience. And so the core survived: the fall of cities, the cost of pride, the fragility of greatness. All held in meter, repeated across generations until a man, perhaps blind, perhaps not, placed them into fixed form. By the time writing returned to Greece, those stories had already lived for centuries without it. When they were finally written down, likely in the late 8th or 7th century BCE, it was not to create them, but to catch them. To fix in letters what had been flowing through mouths and memory for hundreds of years. The Homeric poems do not mention the collapse. They do not speak of drought, of failing trade, of the sea peoples, or the vanishing of literacy. But in their tone, in their sorrow, in their sense of worlds lost and never fully recovered, they hold it. The heroes are mortal. Their glories are brief. Even the victors suffer. Even the gods cannot prevent fate. This is not nostalgia. It is mourning, not for individuals, but for an order, a way of life that had once stretched across the sea, from the Hittite highlands to the Nile, from Cyprus to Crete. When that world ended, its traces scattered. But in the hills of Greece, people remembered in song. They sang of a man who wandered, of a war that left no victors, of homes that could not be returned to unchanged. In the rhythm of those verses, the Bronze Age survives not as history, but as inheritance. And somewhere in that slow cadence, we are reminded that not all collapse is forgotten. Sometimes it sings itself forward, quietly, patiently, waiting for the next voice to carry it. In the late Bronze Age, belief was woven into ever. Why corner of life? The gods were not distant. They were local, responsive, embedded in the hills and rivers, the winds and the harvest. They lived in temples and watched from mountain peaks. Each crop owed them a portion. Each child born a prayer. The world made sense because it was negotiated, offerings made, favor returned. When rain fell, it meant the gods were pleased. When drought arrived, it meant something had gone wrong. But then the rain stopped falling. Slowly, then persistently, not just in one region, but across the eastern Mediterranean. Fields cracked, wells dried, entire growing seasons failed, and people who had long trusted in ritual turned toward the gods for explanation. They did what they had always done: more prayers, more offerings, sacrifices made not with gratitude but with fear. In the city of Ugarit, temple archives tell us that cultic activities increased in the final years. More animals were listed for ritual slaughter. More grain was diverted from storage to the altars. Priests maintained the ceremonies, even as famine crept in from the hills. But the blessings didn't come. The skies remained closed, and the silence was not just from the heavens, it was also from the storerooms. When nothing could be spared, not even the gods were fed. In Hadusa, capital of the Hittite Empire, storm gods once ruled with regularity. Inscriptions speak of treaties sealed in divine name, of festivals where priests and kings dined together under sacred watch. But in the later texts, something shifts. Rituals become more elaborate. Incantations grow longer. There are records of substitute kings, symbolic rulers used in place of the real monarch during bad omens to trick fate. These were not the acts of confidence. They were acts of anxiety. The rituals continued, but belief strained under the weight of unanswered need. When collapse comes quietly, belief is often the first thing to bend. Not because people lose faith, but because they don't know how to reframe it. The gods had always listened. That was the agreement. When they didn't, the problem had to lie with the people. In Egypt, inscriptions from the late New Kingdom record temples growing poorer, fewer offerings, less incense. The divine economy, once richly stocked, faltered along with the human one. Priests still performed the rites. Statues were still bathed and clothed, but the communities that once filled the courtyards thinned. A temple without offerings becomes an echo chamber, and slowly, the certainty that had guided generations gave way to something harder to name: doubt, confusion, or perhaps just quiet endurance. Across the Aegean and the Levant, household shrines began to replace great temples. In the archaeological layers following the collapse, large cult centers disappear, while small, makeshift places of worship appear in homes and rural spaces. Figurines once placed on altars now stood beside hearths. The sacred became smaller, more private, more desperate. This shift wasn't atheism, it was adaptation. The gods had not been banished, but their role had changed. Where once they presided over empires, now they watched over fields that barely yielded. Their images, still carved, still molded in clay, were kept close, not out of devotion alone, but perhaps out of fear that they might not return. In Crete, the Minoan and later Mycenaean traditions had long honored goddesses of fertility and earth. But as the Bronze Age waned, the symbols of these deities became less ornate. Clay tablets stop recording their rituals. Shrines shrink. It's unclear whether people stopped believing or simply stopped expecting. The question that lingers in these layers is not whether belief ended, but whether people felt abandoned, and how they endured that absence. In times of crisis, faith often sharpens or shatters. Some doubled down. Others turned to new deities or new ways of speaking to the old ones. In Cyprus, votive offerings from the post-collapse period show signs of continuity, but also of change. The figures are rougher, more personal, not state-sponsored, but individual, pleas cast in clay. Even in silence, people sought meaning. That is what religion offered, not control, but coherence. And when coherence slipped, when nature no longer aligned with ritual, what remained was not rage. It was weariness, a kind of sacred fatigue. The rites continued, but without reply. And yet not all the gods vanished. Some transformed. Others waited, carried forward in whispered names, hidden in folk practices, tucked into stories told beside drying fields. Mythologies from later eras often preserve fragments of collapse, storms that never ended, gods who turned away, heroes who wandered for decades. Perhaps these were not just metaphors. Perhaps they were memories reframed in a world still grieving. In the end, the temples fell not because belief ended, but because belief, like everything else, needed resources. Priests needed grain, altar. Ares needed goods. The divine economy collapsed alongside the human one, and what remained was simpler. A carved figure on a stone shelf, a murmur before a meal, a prayer said without expectation. When rain stops falling, even gods must adapt. And when they don't, people do, not all at once, not with drama, but slowly in smaller spaces with smaller hopes. And in that quiet, belief continued not in glory but in persistence. A faith reshaped by absence. A reverence no longer certain of being heard but offered anyway. Because even in collapse, people kept looking upward, just in case. In the final shadows of the late Bronze Age, beneath the elegant layers of diplomacy and trade, of palaces and gods and ledgers, something raw and ancient returned. Not in every place, not all at once, but hunger deep, drawn out, and inescapable began to press against the edges of what had once been called civilization. And as the seasons failed and the grain grew scarce, the boundaries between ritual and desperation, between the sacred and the unbearable, began to dissolve. In Egypt, inscriptions from the reign of Ramses III record unrest not just in the outer provinces, but within the temple cities themselves. A document known as the Great Harris Papyrus celebrates the pharaoh's gifts to the gods: grain, cattle, incense. But elsewhere, another truth surfaces. Papyri speak of riots near granaries, of grain prices rising so sharply that a sack became more precious than silver. One document from the village of Deir el-Medina tells us the workers who built the royal tombs went on strike, not for gold, but for bread. When payment was delayed, they laid down their tools, not in rebellion, in hunger. In the Hittite world, the archives thin as the droughts deepen. But a fragment remains, a grim piece of correspondence from the later years, perhaps written in desperation or confession. It records a plea to neighboring lands for barley and ends with a chilling rumor that people had begun to eat their own children. The letter does not dwell. It does not explain. It simply reports, as though the unspeakable had already entered the realm of what could be written. Ugarit, too, once a center of letters and shipping, reveals in its final tablets a palace surrounded by need. The correspondence stops mid-sentence. One king writes to another, "There is famine in our house. We shall die of hunger." No reply follows. In the ruins of the palace, archaeologists found half-baked tablets, words interrupted by fire, or abandonment, or both. The biblical Book of Lamentations, compiled later but drawing from older oral traditions, offers an echo of these sorrows. In its poetic laments over Jerusalem, it describes mothers boiling their infants. Whether literal or metaphorical, the image survives not for shock, but because it marked the collapse of meaning. In a world governed by law and custom, by purity and taboo, such stories are not only records of suffering, they are records of disintegration. The fear of famine has always been more than physical. It strips away the scaffolding that holds a culture together. Hunger rewrites ethics. It makes mockery of status. The noble with gold but no grain becomes powerless. The priest with sacred rites but no flour cannot bake the offering. Laws bend. Rituals falter. What remains is only what can be eaten, traded, buried, or burned. In some of the archaeological layers from this period, in cities across the Aegean and the Levant, pits have been found filled not just with animal bones, but with human remains, broken and charred. The evidence is debated, but its possibility haunts the discussion. If true, it is not monstrous. It is telling. In collapse, people do not become villains. They become exhausted. What they once believed impossible, they come to perform in silence. Grain, once a unit of tax and tribute, became a weapon. Hoarding was not invented in the Bronze Age, but it flourished under pressure. Palace officials and temple managers, once tasked with distributing food to workers, began to protect their stores. Not always maliciously, sometimes as a strategy for survival. But the result was the same. Those without access to state granaries suffered first, the villagers on the outer edges, the unrecorded workers. The children of shepherds who had no tribute to offer. In Cyprus, one coastal settlement shows a sharp decrease in animal remains and an increase in foraged shellfish and wild seeds. It's a small detail, but it reveals a community moving away from domesticated diets, returning, in effect, to the logic of hunger. Gather what you can, burn what you must, chew what is bitter, endure. We must be careful not to imagine this as a world of constant agony. Most people survived. They did so through adaptation, through migration, through hardship softened by community. But there were moments, sharp, brief, and unforgettable, when the social contract tore. When the hand that once offered bread became a closed fist. When a parent, faced with the slow death of a child, reached beyond reason. Ancient societies were not naive about this. They built grain silos, they stored surplus, they regulated prices. But no system lasts forever without rain. And when that system failed, stories emerged not as warnings, but as scars. Even the myths remember. In Greek tradition, the goddess Demeter, grieving for her lost daughter, withholds the harvest from the world. It is a tale of absence, of famine born not from sin, but from sorrow. In Mesopotamian texts, great floods and famines follow broken covenants between gods and men. Hunger was never just agricultural, it was moral, cosmic. And when it arrived, it asked not just what one would eat, but what one was willing to lose in order to survive. Famine records do not come with music. They come with numbers, with strange absences, with burial sites unmarked, with ash, with sentences that trail off. In this chapter of history, the archive becomes an elegy, a record not of events, but of the quiet undoing of structure. Still, people endured. They left the cities. They found new hills, new rivers, smaller fields. They returned to simplicity not because they chose it, but because the alternative was starvation. They remembered, perhaps not always the names of kings, but the shapes of tools, the taste of wild greens, the way to boil water from cracked earth. These were not acts of triumph. They were acts of defiance against hunger's erasure. And somewhere, as the fires dimmed and the wind moved through empty courts, the echoes of grief remained in the stories of noble families fallen, of gods unappeased, of mothers who gave what they could not bear to speak aloud. History often records what it can measure: grain counts, palace inventories, death tolls, but famine leaves behind something harder to quantify: a silence, a pause in continuity, a choice no one should have to make. And in that pause, civilization becomes something fragile, something human, something that, even when broken, still tries to keep going. In the years after the collapse, there were no farewell songs, no final speeches recorded in stone, no scrolls rolled shut with trembling hands. What vanished was quieter, less visible, a syllable not repeated, a vowel swallowed into another, a grammar softened by time and confusion. And in that slow unraveling, language itself, not just the act of writing, but the very sounds by which people knew themselves, began to disappear. When the palaces fell, their scripts went first. Linear B, once etched onto tablets in the storerooms of Pylos and Knossos, ceased to exist, not because it was banned or lost in war, but because the scribes stopped writing and the children stopped learning. Its last words were inventories, tallies of oil and cloth. The language it recorded, an early form of Greek, would survive, but the script would not. For generations, no one in Greece would write again. And in the absence of script, dialects drifted. Local words returned. Foreign terms faded. The neat administrative Greek of the palaces dissolved into dozens of spoken tongues, none of them uniform, none of them preserved. In Anatolia, the Hittite Empire had built a massive bureaucracy, inscribing treaties, rituals, and laws in a cuneiform adapted from Mesopotamia. They spoke the world's oldest recorded Indo-European language, and they recorded it with diligence. But when Hattusa fell, so too did Hittite. Not just the empire, not just the archive, the language itself. It did not evolve into something else. It was not absorbed. It ended. No one speaks it today. And for centuries, no one even knew it had existed. There were others, the Luyans of Western Anatolia, whose language survives in scattered inscriptions and undeciphered signs. The Hurrians, whose tongue faded as their cities emptied. The Kassites, who ruled Babylon but left behind only fragments of their speech. The people of Ugarit, whose elegant cuneiform alphabet encoded a Semitic tongue that vanished when their port city burned. These were not mere dialects. They were worlds, full systems of meaning, of metaphor, of memory. And they slipped away with each burned tablet, each closed mouth, each burial without a word. Not all of these languages were written. Many were never recorded at all. They existed only in voice, passed from mother to child, from elder to apprentice. They lived in lullabies, in gossip, in instructions spoken across fields. And when drought scattered the villages, when famine sent families into flight, those languages began to fray. Children adopted the words of neighbors or of conquerors. They blended or forgot. And in the space of a few generations, Something ancient dissolved completely, not because it failed, but because it was no longer repeated. Linguists call this a language death, but that phrase is clinical. What really happens is quieter. The last speaker of a tongue does not always know they are the last. They speak the words that once belonged to a village, a lineage, a people. But when no one answers in kind, the language stops being a shared thing. It becomes memory, and then silence. In the archaeological record, this loss is mostly invisible. Pottery shards don't speak. Ruins don't conjugate verbs, but there are hints, names carved in unfamiliar scripts that are never seen again. Place names that shift as new arrivals rename rivers and hills. Scribbles in faded ink that no one can read, not because they were encoded, but because their alphabet has no descendants. What makes it harder still is that many of these cultures believed in the sacredness of speech. In some traditions, knowledge was not to be written. It was to be spoken. To write it down was to confine it. And so when these people vanished through drought, migration, assimilation, their knowledge vanished with them. Their myths, their remedies, their proverbs, their jokes, all gone not with violence but with forgetting. And the silence spread unevenly. In Egypt, the language endured though its written forms changed. In Mesopotamia, Akkadian lingered for centuries before giving way to Aramaic. But in the highlands, the valleys, the coastal enclaves, where small languages had flourished alongside trade, the silence grew deeper. It's estimated that dozens of languages disappeared in this period. Perhaps more, most left behind no name. Imagine a lullaby sung in a tongue that no longer exists, a name whispered in grief, never written, a law recited in rhythm, remembered only by a few. These were not grand speeches. They were the fabric of daily life. And when the speakers dispersed, when children stopped answering in the same tongue, that fabric unraveled. We sometimes imagine that history is written by the victors, but much of human history was never written at all. It was spoken. And when those voices fell silent, whole chapters ended without a trace. Even now, we search the ruins for clues. In Cyprus, in Crete, in inland Syria. We find undeciphered tablets, half-phrases, names that resist translation. The silence is not empty. It is full of language we cannot reach. But there's also something soft in that loss. A reminder that even in collapse, people still spoke. They spoke while walking, while digging, while holding their children. They found new ways to say what they needed. They borrowed, they blended, they began again. New languages emerged. Greek would rise again, changed. Aramaic would spread. Phoenician would give birth to alphabets that still shape our world. But for each language that survived, there were others that did not. And they are gone not because they were weaker or less refined, but because the world that held them changed too quickly for them to hold on. In the long quiet that followed the Bronze Age collapse, the soundscape of the world shifted. What was once a chorus became a murmur. And in that murmur, new voices rose, layered atop the silenced ones, never quite replacing them, never quite remembering. History does not always record what it loses. Sometimes it only notices after it's gone. A script no longer legible. A name that no longer means. A song no one sings. And in that emptiness, we are left to wonder not what was said, but how it must have sounded. And though we may never hear those languages again, the earth still holds them in untranslatable fragments, in unfinished signs, in the shape of a tongue long buried, but once spoken under the same sky. The fire came late, long after the shouting stopped, after the granaries were emptied, after the gates were broken. In cities once ruled by ledgers and ink, by ritual calendars and diplomatic treaties, there was one room that burned last, the archive. It was not coincidence, it was pattern. In city after city, when destruction came, the rooms filled with tablets were left until the end, as if even the conquerors paused before setting flame to knowledge. Or as if, in some quiet instinct, they knew these rooms held something beyond conquest. In Ugarit, a port city that once traded languages as easily as goods, the archive room stood deep inside the royal palace. Thousands of tablets, written in cuneiform in Ugaritic and Akkadian, stacked on wooden shelves, laid flat in baskets, pressed and baked with the business of a complex world. Legal codes, agricultural inventories, epic hymns, letters between kings. And as the palace fell, as the final pleas for grain went unanswered, the tablets remained untouched, until the flames reached them. But fire, for all its destruction, does something strange to clay. When a tablet is only sun-dried, it's fragile. A soft push can crumble centuries of language. But when fire comes, if the burn is hot and even, it can harden clay into permanence. It turns record into relic. And so, paradoxically, the burning of Ugarit preserved its memory. The final library, baked in a moment of collapse, served to be read again, 3,000 years later. In Hadusa, capital of the Hittite Empire, the great temple once housed a vast archive. Over 30,000 tablets arranged in rooms dedicated to law, to religion, to science. The Hittites were organized, obsessed with detail. Their scribes recorded the weight of sacrifices, the proper phrases for rituals, the omens of birds and storms. They copied foreign treaties alongside hymns to their gods. And when the empire fell, the temple stood empty. Its archive, too, was left until the end. Charred beams collapsed around shelves still full of text. The fire came late, but it came. Archaeologists found the rooms just as they had fallen. Tablets scattered, some split by heat, others hardened to ceramic. Their writing still legible. They tell no stories of their own destruction. But in the silence that follows the last entry, there is a wait. A moment preserved not in words, but in absence. Other cities tell the same tale. In Ebla, in Mari, in Amar, the archives were tucked deep in inner chambers, not because they were sacred, but because they were necessary. They were the machinery of civilization. Without them, debts vanished, laws blurred, alliances faded. To destroy an archive was to sever memory from power. But fire does not ask permission. Sometimes it was accidental, a burning wall that collapsed inward. Sometimes it was deliberate, a torch thrown in anger or fear. In either case, the record keepers rarely had time to flee with their work. Their styluses were dropped mid-script, their baskets never carried out. Some tablets were only half written. Sentences end mid-line. An appeal to a distant king, a grain count not tallied, a prayer unfinished. We don't know who these scribes were. Their names were rarely written down, but their hands shaped history. They were trained young, taught to memorize signs, to copy formulas, to hold language in their grip. In a world without paper, without redundancy, they were the guardians of knowledge, not its owners, but its stewards. And when the cities fell, they were among the last to stop working. Some may have tried to save what they could. Clay is heavy, too heavy to carry far. But perhaps a few tablets were hidden, buried, tucked under thresholds, most remained. And when the roofs collapsed, when the flames turned shelves to smoke, the tablets waited beneath the ash, scorched, but not erased. There's something haunting about these rooms. Not because of what was lost, but because of what was spared. The tablets that remain are not the epics, not the great poems. They are the ordinary contracts, recipes, weather reports. And in that ordinariness, they tell us everything. They show us how people lived, what they feared, what they counted, what they hoped might continue. The act of archiving is hopeful. It assumes someone will read it later, that there will be a later. To store a tablet is to say this mattered, and in cities now reduced to dust, those rooms remain as the last voice. not of kings, but of record. And yet not every archive burned. Some dissolved more slowly. Neglect, damp, earthquake. The silence that follows a collapse can be more damaging than fire. Without readers, records rot. But when the fire comes, when it comes late and hot, it preserves. A tragedy, yes, but also a strange gift. In modern museums, these fire-baked relics sit in glass, labeled, cataloged, translated. Visitors read them with reverence, but their original scribes never expected us. They wrote for their world, not for ours. They wrote for kings who are now unknown, for gods whose names have faded, for systems that no longer exist. And still, the fire left them to us. It's tempting to imagine that knowledge, once written, lasts forever. But archives are fragile. They depend on attention, on care, on peace. The fire in those rooms was not just the end of a city, it was the end of a worldview, and yet somehow it carried part of that world forward. In Ugarit, a list of musical scales survived, the oldest notated melody in the world. In Hattusa, an international treaty, older than any known constitution. In Amar, a prayer for rain. Words shaped by hand, pressed into clay, stored in baskets, and burned into memory. Fire destroys, but sometimes it lets us listen again, to rooms that no longer stand, to languages no one speaks, to moments that, for a flicker of heat, became eternal. In the ruins of forgotten cities, beneath toppled walls and broken staircases, there's often a thin layer of gray. A band of ash, settled like a whisper, pressed gently between clay and stone. For the archaeologist, it is a line of finality, a mark that says, here something ended. And though each layer is just a few centimeters thick, it holds the memory of fire, of collapse, of the moment when a life once busy with ritual and trade and repetition was stilled. Across the eastern Mediterranean, in the wake of the late Bronze Age, these ashes are. Not rare, they appear again and again in Ugarit, in Mycenae, in Hattusa, and beyond. Sometimes they come with signs of war, arrowheads embedded in doorways, charred beams and fallen gates, but just as often they come without drama. No corpses, no weapons, just silence and soot. A room filled with pottery abandoned and burned. A collapsed ceiling that buried a kitchen mid-meal. These are not scenes of conquest. They are moments of unraveling, paused and preserved. In the city of Ugarit, the fire swept through the palace with strange selectivity. Some rooms were gutted, others left intact. The walls remain high, the thresholds unbroken, but the floors covered in ash, a sign not of looting but of abandonment, of rooms left full, of possessions too heavy to carry. The fire, when it came, was not a siege. It was an afterthought, a final breath through empty halls. Hattusa, the heart of the Hittite Empire, shows a similar quiet. Its temples and storehouses bear the marks of flame, but not of battle. The layers of ash suggest a controlled burn, something set after the city had already been left. Perhaps by its own people, perhaps by those who found it afterward. No one returned to rebuild. The empire that once stretched across Anatolia vanished into hills and dust. In Mycenaean Greece, the palatial centers followed the same pattern. Pylos burned in a single sweep. The archive rooms filled with tablets were baked into permanence. But there is no record of enemy arrival, no grand fight. The fire may have begun by accident or as a desperate act, a controlled destruction in a world growing less controllable. At Turin's, at Thebes, at Knossos, similar bands of ash line the layers of soil, not like scars, but like sighs. Not always sudden, often slow. This is the texture of ruin, not a grand explosion, but a soft crumbling. A city doesn't always fall with a scream. Sometimes it fades with a whisper. A harvest fails, a shipment does arrive. A priest doesn't show up to light the altar. One family moves out, then another. The market thins, the guards stop coming. And then one day the embers catch on the thatch and what was already broken becomes a memory. Archaeology often works in layers, not just of soil, but of emotion. The deeper you dig, the more tender the world becomes. You find a child's toy in a collapsed room, a cooking pot cracked in heat, footprints frozen in hardened mud. These aren't signs of conquest. They are echoes of people who didn't finish what they started. A bowl left on a table, a loom half-threaded, lives interrupted, not always violently, but irrevocably. And not all ash is equal. In some cities, the layers are thick, full of blackened timber, melted plaster, heaps of roof tile. But in others, the ash is light, almost gentle, as if the fire that consumed the city had no hurry. It burned slow, or it came late, after the people had already gone. Some layers show rebuilding, a wall added atop the rubble, a new hearth laid over the old. These are rare but telling. They show resilience or stubbornness, a belief that the ruin was not final, that the city still had a pulse. But even these efforts fade. The rebuilt walls are shorter, the homes simpler, and eventually they too are covered in dust. Across time, these layers of ash became soil. Grass grew, trees returned, animals wandered through what had once been marketplaces. And the memory of the fire of the people who once passed through that gate, prayed at that altar, argued in that room, drifted away, unrecorded. And yet beneath all of it, the ash remains. A pale line, hidden until someone uncovers it with a trowel and a brush, pausing over what looks like a smear but is, in truth, a sentence. A closing sentence. Not of an empire, but of a family. Not of a kingdom, but of a corner of a house where someone once sat and waited for the rains to return. The late Bronze Age did not end in a single blaze. It ended in hundreds, some large, some quiet, some set by strangers, others by neighbors, or even by those who had lived in the city all their lives and could no longer stay. And so they left, or they stayed and watched, or they stood beside the fire and understood it for what it was, not an end, but a confirmation. Civilizations fall not just through failure, but through fatigue. When too many systems stretch too thin, when too many answers stop working, when the gods are silent and the grain won't grow and the roads no longer feel safe. The fire becomes a form of punctuation, a full stop in clay and smoke. And now we read that punctuation in the dirt, not with words, but with layers, with charcoal and pottery, with singed stone. And in those ashes beneath the palaces, we don't find destruction. We find departure, a closing gesture, a moment when someone, perhaps wordlessly, let go of what had once been built to last forever. And the ruins, long buried, keep that memory, quiet, unhurried, waiting for someone to listen. And the sea. In centuries that followed the great unraveling, the world did not end. It quieted. It forgot. And slowly, the tangled threads of memory, soaked in hunger, ash, and drought, were rewoven into stories easier to hold. A city once known for its shipping records became the home of a fallen hero. A kingdom broken by famine became a cautionary tale about angering the gods. The slow grind of ecological collapse softened into poetic verses, and the names of real places were smoothed into half-remembered syllables, recited around hearths by children who had never seen a palace, or a cargo ship, or a scribe's reed pen. Memory, when passed too far, doesn't vanish. It reshapes. And in the eastern Mediterranean, the reshaping began early. By the time Homer sang of Troy, the real city, Wilusa, as it was once known, had been buried for over 400 years. Its causeways had crumbled. Its walls, blackened and collapsed, were swallowed by time and earth. But echoes lingered. Stories of great wars, of kings with pride too large for their ships, of storms that scattered fleets and gods who took sides in battles too human to be divine. None of it was precise. But all of it, somehow, was true. There had been a Troy, there had been burning. There had been a Bronze Age world where merchants knew 3 languages and clay tablets told of tin caravans that crossed empires. But that world had no ballads, it left no epics. It spoke in inventories and receipts, palace edicts, and grain allocations. And when that world fell, its language, the dry, administrative rhythm of survival, was not what survived. What endured was something else, a sense of loss, transmuted into legend. In Ugarit, the scribes had written meticulously debt records, shipping manifests, prayers to Baal. But no one copied their style. No later people sang of unpaid barley loans or letters pleading for grain ships. Instead, what filtered through the centuries were hazier impressions, gods of storms and sea, cities sunk by fire, destinies rewritten by divine indifference. The things that could be measured were forgotten. The things that could be sung were not. By the time of classical Greece, the Bronze Age had become a vague shadow. The people of Athens walked atop layers of soil that covered the ruins of their forebears. They did not call themselves Mycenaean. They didn't need to. They had new gods now, though their names were often older than they realized. Zeus, Athena, Apollo all carried the faint fingerprints of older divinities, molded and renamed, but still carrying something brittle and ancient within them. Religion, too, had undergone its transformation. Where once rituals begged the sky for rain, they now asked for favor in war or love or fortune. Climate had been recast as character. Drought was no longer a cycle, it was a punishment, a test, or a curse. And so the children who listened to stories at dusk learned not about supply chain failure or administrative overreach, but about hubris. About the man who built a tower too tall, or a king who hoarded gold and was struck down by fate. The stories taught lessons, but not history. They were warm, cautionary, easy to pass down, unlike the brittle, breakable truths of past mistakes. This forgetting was not malicious. It was human. It is easier to blame a god than to map a rainfall anomaly across regions. Easier to craft a tale of invasion than to explain how trade networks collapse when one port city starves and another cannot send ships. Complexity doesn't sing well. It doesn't rhyme. It doesn't fit into an evening's tale told before sleep. So myth stepped in not to deceive, but to soften. And yet inside the myths, little fossils of fact remained. The Iliad does not name the sea peoples, but it describes raiders from far lands. It does not record a drought, but it shows a king refusing to share food. It does not mention collapsed grain economies, but its landscapes are littered with abandoned homes, grieving widows, and quiet fields. The bones of history still lay beneath the poetry. Elsewhere, the Hittites, once bureaucrats of extraordinary scale, vanished almost entirely from folk memory. Their stone lions and royal roads faded from speech, but echoes of their kings and customs resurfaced in later Anatolian traditions, in folk festivals and place names, like pebbles nudged forward by streams of culture. What could not be spoken anymore was absorbed instead, through rituals, through melody. Through the stubborn survival of certain words that no one quite remembered, yet still used. Egypt, for a time, preserved more. Its scribes, isolated by geography and shielded by the Nile, recorded their crises with ink and stone. The inscriptions of Ramses III still cry out about famine, riots, and theft. But even here, as centuries passed, clarity blurred. Foreign invasions were blamed for chaos that was far more internal. The gods were thanked for victories that never truly came. The tombs told of order, but the living wail. Ked in disorder, and slowly even Egypt rewrote itself. We like to imagine that great collapses leave loud marks, but often the opposite is true. They leave gaps, silences. And over time, those silences become the perfect homes for story. Into the blank spaces of memory, we place dragons, curses, wars of destiny. We fill them with meaning, because to leave them empty is unbearable. So the great palaces became temples in the tales. The bureaucrats became kings. The scribes faded and the warriors remained. The slow erosion of climate and economy transformed into the moment when a hero fell or a goddess turned away. It was cleaner. It could be told aloud. It could be remembered. And in this way, one civilization forgot another, not in malice, but in mercy. The memories were too heavy, the details too cruel. It is easier to tell of a city's fall than to explain why its irrigation canals ran dry. Easier to speak of divine wrath than of poor harvest management. The past became a painting, still recognizable but altered, stylized, edges blurred. Even now, as archaeologists unearth the truths buried in ash and soil, they must sift through layers of legend. They read the clay tablets that were never meant to last 3,000 years. They interpret pollen and tree rings, not because myths lie, but because myths remember in metaphor. They don't tell what happened. They tell what it felt like. And so, in the end, perhaps myth did what the old record keepers could not. It made collapse speakable, survivable, lovable even. It gave sorrow rhythm. It gave loss a name. And though it obscured the causes, it preserved the ache. When memory turns to legend, not everything is lost, just transformed. And somewhere in that transformation, beneath the flourishes and the gods and the epic verse, a quiet truth still hums, softly, like an old song you don't remember learning, but somehow know by heart. The noise had faded, the ships no longer docked, the scribes no longer pressed tablets. The palaces stood hollow, their corridors echoing with wind, and from this great silence, this long and aching hush that settled over what had once been the Bronze Age world, something else began. Quietly, uncertainly. A beginning born not of triumph, but of necessity, not with fanfare, but with the low rustle of survival. Across the shattered edges of old kingdoms, people remained. They did not rebuild Mycenae's grand megarons or Ugarit's palace courtyards. They did not rewrite the laws of Hadusa. Instead, they turned inward. They climbed into hills, moved inland, and settled where the soil still yielded something, anything. The new villages were small, a few homes dug into slopes or built of stone and brush. No drainage systems, no roads paved by kings, just footpaths, just patience. What came after collapse was not a renaissance. It was recovery in the slowest, most human sense. A rebuilding not of empires, but of habits. No one tried to remake the world they had lost. They built what they could carry. And in doing so, they unknowingly laid the first stones of a very different future. In Cyprus, the copper mines still existed, but trade was gone. So mining slowed, then paused. In Greece, the linear B script used by palace scribes simply disappeared. For centuries, writing fell out of daily life. No new tablets, no new ledgers. Instead, memory lived in voice alone, in songs, in chants, in the silent repetition of tasks taught by hand. A child learned how to grind barley not from a written rule, but from the rhythm of a mother's body at the stone. In Anatolia, the old Hittite cities crumbled beneath dust. In their place, new settlements emerged with no walls, no monuments, just hearths and grazing goats. The earth was healing, but so was culture, reborn not through design but through need. When palace economies vanished, barter returned. Villagers traded wool for pots, goats for grain. Prestige items, lapis, ivory, glass vanished from daily use. Bronze, once the measure of power, became rare. Weapons dulled, tools bent. Simpler alternatives took their place. Wood, bone, reused shards. In some places, people forgot entirely how to cast metal. And yet, life went on. In the Levant, urban life shrank. People moved to tell hills and dry plains, digging into caves or building on mounds that had once housed their ancestors. The ruins of old cities became the quarries of new ones. Fallen stones were lifted, relaid, reshaped. There was no romance in this, only practicality. Survival used what was close. Religious life, too, transformed. Gone were the great temples with carved columns and vast courtyards. In their place, local shrines, simple altars, and offerings of grain or water. People still reached for the divine, but their prayers were more intimate now, less ceremonial, more pleading. They asked for rain, for fertility, for calm seas, no longer as citizens of an empire, but as neighbors to hunger. The silence of the archives meant that no one wrote down the moment when this new world began. It crept into being slowly over generations. A grandfather who remembered how to read and a grandson who never needed to. A woman who had once been a palace worker, now living in a hut with no roof tiles, grinding grain for her own household. The transition was not marked by war or proclamation. It was marked by loss, by forgetting, and by adaptation. What was reborn was smaller. Communities became insular, travel became rare. Where once ships had crossed seas carrying goods and gossip, now journeys spanned only a few valleys. The interconnectedness of the Bronze Age dissolved into patchworks of local customs. Dialects shifted, dress changed, and so did time. Without centralized calendars, seasons were measured by the land itself, when the river swelled, when the barley sprouted, when the herds moved. The sun's position meant more than any written tablet ever had. And yet within this quiet new world, the seeds of something else were stirring. In Greece, the Dark Age pottery grew more refined over time. Designs returned. Not the palace motifs of old, but new ones, circles, lines, spirals, abstract, perhaps, but alive. In the Near East, some regions began to relearn metallurgy. In Cyprus, bronze production slowly resumed, though on a modest scale. Innovation returned not in a burst, but in scattered sparks. A new world was not being built with blueprints. It was being assembled by memory, improvisation, and endurance. Children born in this age knew nothing of palaces. To them, the ruins were simply part of the landscape, places not to mourn but to explore. Their lives were shaped by scarcity, but also by closeness. A shared meal mattered more when it came from one's own labor. Knowledge passed down became sacred. A story told at the fire, a method for drying fish, a song to call animals home. These were the new scrolls, the oral libraries of survival. And as generations passed, the old names faded. Hadusa, Ugarit, Mycenae, spoken only in fading echoes. The gods, too, changed. Some were forgotten, others merged. In this world, there were no longer state cults or royal decrees. There were small rituals, local spirits, offerings left beneath trees. And if you looked hard, you could still find a broken figurine in the soil. A chipped seal, a ring from a finger long vanished. Remnants not of splendor, but of people who once tried, once believed, once lived. This new world was humbler. It didn't boast of monuments or achievements. It didn't leave inscriptions carved in stone, but in its quietness it endured. It gave birth to new languages, new myths, and new ways of being. The Iron Age would come eventually. Cities would rise again. Writing would return. But what mattered most was that, in the wake of collapse, humanity had not disappeared. It had bent, it had crouched, but it had not broken. And so the final chapter of the Bronze Age was not one of fire, but of embers. Small, glowing, scattered across the hills, kept alive by hands that did not know history but knew hunger and wind and the feel of the earth when it is ready to plant again. The people of this era left few records, but their survival was its own message, one written not in clay or stone, but in breath and blood and motion. Sometimes a new world is not born with vision, but with need. It is not dreamt, it is endured. It is whispered into being by those with nothing to spare and everything to lose. And though it may rise in silence, it is no less worthy of memory. In the end, it was not the fall of kings that defined this age, but the quiet continuation of the nameless. the farmers who returned to ruined fields, the potters who shaped vessels with old techniques and new hope, the children who ran barefoot through abandoned courtyards unaware they played atop history. And in their quiet footsteps, a future began simpler, yes, but still beating, still human, still here.